All right, welcome back. Although we are in a new semester, we still are going to go back and hit Reconstruction. And so this chapter is about Reconstruction and how that affected what was going to be happening in the United States following the Civil War. Now, after the Civil War, it is important to understand that much of the South lay in ruin. In fact, one South Carolinian actually, told a Northern reporter that it passes my comprehension to tell what became of our railroads. We had passably good roads on which we could reach almost any part of the state, and the next week they were all gone. Not simply broken up, but gone. Some of the material was burned, I know, but miles and miles of iron have actually disappeared, gone out of existence. Now, while he was talking about the roads and the railroads, he might as well have been talking about the entire antebellum way of life. The future of the South was uncertain, to say the least. How could these states be brought back into the United States? Would they be conquered territories or equal states? And how are they going to rebuild their governments, their economies, their social systems? What rights did freedom confer on the formerly enslaved people? The answers to a lot of these questions hinged on the concepts of citizenship and equality. The era witnessed perhaps the most open and widespread discussions of citizenship since the nation's founding. It was a moment of revolutionary possibility and violent backlash. African Americans and radical Republicans pushed the nation to finally realize the Declaration of Independence's promise that all men are created equal and have certain unalienable rights. White Democrats granted African Americans legal freedom, but little more. When Black Americans and their radical allies succeeded in securing citizenship for freed people, a new fight commenced to determine the legal, political, and social implications of American citizenship. Resistance continued and Reconstruction eventually collapsed. In the South, limits on human freedom endured and would stand for nearly a century more. Here in Section 2, we're going to talk about the politics of Reconstruction. Reconstruction, or the effort to restore Southern states to the Union and to redefine African Americans' place in American society, actually began before the Civil War ended. Abraham Lincoln had been planning for the reunification of the United States all the way back in the fall of 1863. With a sense that Union victory was imminent and that he could turn the tide of the war simply by stroking the Unionist support in Confederate states, Lincoln issued a proclamation allowing Southerners to take an oath of allegiance. When just 10% of a state's voting population had taken such an oath, loyal Unionists could then establish governments. These so-called Lincoln governments sprang up in pockets where Union support existed, like Louisiana, Tennessee, and Arkansas. Unsurprisingly, these were also the places that were exempted from the liberating effects of the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, initially proposed as a war goal, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation committed the United States to the abolition of slavery. However, the proclamation freed only slaves in the area of rebellion and left more than 700,000 in bondage in places like Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, Missouri, as well as those three states like Louisiana, Tennessee, and even Virginia, parts of Virginia. To cement the abolition of slavery, Congress had to pass the 13th Amendment, and they did so on January 31st of 1865. The amendment legally abolished slavery, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. Section 2 of the amendment granted Congress the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. State ratification followed, and by the end of the year, the requisite 3/4 of the states had approved the amendment, and 4 million people were forever free from slavery that had existed in North America for 250 years. Lincoln's policy was quite lenient. It was very conservative and very, very short-lived. Reconstruction really changed when John Wilkes Booth shot Abraham Lincoln on April 14th of 1865 during a performance of Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater. Treated rapidly and with all possible care, Lincoln nevertheless succumbed to his wounds the following morning, leaving a very somber pall over the North, and especially among African Americans. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln propelled Vice President Andrew Johnson into the executive office in April 1865. Johnson, a states' rights, strict constructionist, an unapologetic racist from Tennessee, offered Southern states a very quick restoration into the Union. His Reconstruction plan required provisional Southern governments to void their ordinance of secession, repudiate their Confederate debts, and ratify the 13th Amendment. On all other matters, the conventions could do what they wanted with no federal interference. He pardoned all Southerners engaged in the rebellion, with the exception of wealthy planters who possessed more than $20,000 in property. The Southern aristocracy would have to appeal to Johnson for individual pardons. In the meantime, Johnson hoped that the new class of Southerners would replace the extremely wealthy in leadership positions. Many Southern governments enacted legislation that reestablished antebellum power relationships. South Carolina and Mississippi passed laws known as black codes to regulate black behavior and impose social and economic control. These laws granted some rights to African Americans, like the right to own property, to marry, or to make contracts, but they also denied fundamental rights. White lawmakers forbade black men from serving on juries or in state militias. They refused to recognize black testimony against white people, apprenticed orphaned children to their former masters, and established severe vagrancy laws. Mississippi's vagrant law required all freedmen to carry papers proving they had means of employment. If they had no proof, they could be arrested and fined. If they couldn't pay the fine, the sheriff had the right to hire out his prisoner to anyone who was willing to pay the tax. Similar ambiguous vagrancy laws throughout the South reasserted control over black labor in what one scholar has called slavery by another name. Black codes effectively criminalized black people's leisure time. It limited their mobility and locked many into exploitive farming contracts. Attempts to restore the antebellum economic order largely succeeded. These laws and outrageous mob violence against black Southerners led Republicans to call for more dramatic Reconstruction. So when Johnson announced that the Southern states had been restored, congressional Republicans refused to even seat their delegates from the newly reconstructed states. Republicans in Congress responded with a spat of legislation aimed at protecting freedmen and restructuring political relations in the South. Many Republicans were keen to grant voting rights for freedmen in order to build a new powerful voting bloc. Some Republicans, like U.S. Congressman Thaddeus Stevens, believed in racial equality, but the majority were motivated primarily by the interest of their political party. The only way to protect Republican interest in the South was to give the vote to the hundreds of thousands of black men. Republicans in Congress responded to the codes with Civil Rights Act of 1866. This was the first federal attempt to constitutionally define all American-born residents, except Native peoples, of course, as citizens. The law also prohibited any curtailment of citizens' quote, fundamental rights. The 14th Amendment developed concurrently with the Civil Rights Act to ensure its constitutionality. The House of Representatives approved the 14th Amendment on June 13, 1866. Section 1 granted citizenship and repealed the Taney Court's infamous Dred Scott decision. Moreover, it ensured that the state laws could not deny due process or discriminate against any particular group of people. The 14th Amendment signaled the government's willingness to enforce the Bill of Rights over the authority of the states, which is huge. Because he didn't believe that African Americans deserved equal rights, President Johnson opposed the passage of the 14th Amendment and actually vetoed the Civil Rights Act. But after winning a two-thirds majority in the 1866 midterm elections, Republicans overrode his veto, and in 1867 they passed the first Reconstruction Act, dissolving state governments and dividing the South into 5 military districts. Under these terms, states would have to ratify the 14th Amendment, write new constitutions enfranchising black Americans, and abolish the repressive black codes before they could rejoin the Union. In the face of President Johnson's repeated obstructionism, the House of Representatives issued articles of impeachment against the president. And although Johnson narrowly escaped conviction in the Senate, Congress won the power to direct a new phase of Reconstruction. 6 weeks later, on July 9th of 1868, the states ratified the 14th Amendment, guaranteeing birthright citizenship and equal protection under the law. In 1868 presidential election, former Union General Ulysses S. Grant ran on a platform that proclaimed, "Let us have peace." in which he promised to protect new status quo. On the other hand, the Democratic candidate Horatio Seymour promised to repeal Reconstruction. Black Southern voters helped Grant win most of the former Confederacy. Reconstruction brought the first moment of mass democratic participation for African Americans. In 1860, only 5 states in the North allowed African Americans to vote on equal terms with whites. Yet, after 1867, when Congress ordered Southern states to eliminate racial discrimination in voting, African Americans began to win elections across the South. In a short time, the South was transformed from an all-white, pro-slavery Democratic stronghold to a collection of Republican-led states with African Americans in positions of power for the first time in American history. Through the provisions of the Congressional Reconstruction Acts, Black men voted in large numbers and also served as delegates to the state constitutional conventions in 1868. They were also actively participating in revising state constitutions. One of the most significant accomplishments of these conventions was the establishment of public school systems. While public schools were virtually non-existent in the antebellum period, by the end of Reconstruction, every Southern state had established a public school system. Republican officials opened state institutions like mental asylums, hospitals, orphanages, and prisons to hold white and black residents, though often on a segregated basis. They actively sought industrial development, northern investment, and internal improvements. African Americans served at every level of government during Reconstruction. At the federal level, Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce were chosen as U.S. Senators from Mississippi. 14 men served in the House of Representatives, and at least 270 other African American men served in patronage positions as postmasters, customs officials, assessors, and ambassadors. At the state level, more than 1,000 African American men held offices in the South. P.B.S. Pinchback served as Louisiana's governor for 34 days after the previous governor was suspended during impeachment proceedings and was the only African American state governor until Virginia elected L. Douglas Wilder in 1989. Almost 800 African American men served as state legislators around the South, with African Americans at one time making up a majority in the South Carolina House of Representatives. African American office holders came with diverse backgrounds. Many had been free or had gained freedom before the Civil War. Many African Americans, particularly those in the South Carolina, Virginia, and Louisiana, were wealthy and well-educated, 2 facts that distinguished them from much of the white population both before and after the Civil War. Some, like Antoine Dubuislet of Louisiana and William Breedlove from Virginia, owned slaves before the Civil War. Others helped slaves escape or taught them to read, like Georgia's James D. Porter. Most African American office holders, however, gained their freedom during the war. Among them were skilled craftsmen like Emmanuel Fortune, who was a shoemaker from Florida, ministers like James D. Lynch from Mississippi, teachers like William Turner from Alabama. Moving into political office was a natural continuation of leadership roles that they had held in their former slave communities. By the end of Reconstruction in 1877, more than 2,000 African American men had served in offices ranging from local level commissioner to U.S. Senator. When the end of Reconstruction returned white Democrats to power in the South, all but a few African American office holders lost their positions. And after Reconstruction, African Americans did not enter the political arena again in large numbers until well into the 20th century. And that brings us to an end of Section 2. Thank you.